The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished black stone and living crystal. And today it held representatives from 347 species who had gathered to decide the fate of a small blue world. Called Earth-Eye Arbiter Veltorak stood at the central platform, his tall gray body casting a long shadow across the holographic display that showed the Sol system in perfect detail. And his 4 eyes moved slowly across the assembled delegates as he prepared to deliver news that would change everything for humanity. Fellow members of the Council, he began. His voice translated instantly into hundreds of languages through the neural links that connected every being in the chamber. I bring grave tidings from our long-range observation posts. The holographic display shifted and zoomed outward, past the edge of the Sol system, past the nearest stars, until it showed a vast region of empty space that was no longer empty at all. A darkness moved there, a living cloud that seemed to swallow the light of distant stars. And even through the hologram, the delegates could feel a primal fear stirring in their hearts. Class 7 Devour Swarm has altered its trajectory, Veltorak continued, and his voice remained steady even as whispers of horror spread through the chamber. It now moves directly toward the Sol system and will arrive in approximately 94 standard cycles. Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat in the small section reserved for humanity, a species that had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago. And she felt her blood turn cold as she stared at the approaching nightmare on the display. She had read about the Devour Swarms in the historical archives that the Council had shared with Earth after first contact. And she knew what they were capable of doing. These were not creatures that could be reasoned with or negotiated with or even truly understood, for they were something older than most civilizations. A force of consumption that moved through the galaxy like a plague of locusts moving through a field of grain. They ate everything in their path, from asteroids to moons to planets themselves. And they grew larger and more numerous with every world they consumed. The Council has studied this threat extensively, Veltorak said, and he gestured to bring up historical records that showed world after world being stripped bare by the endless hunger of the swarm. In the 50,000 years since we first encountered these entities, no civilization has ever successfully stopped their advance. Elena watched the images of dead worlds scroll past. Planets that had once held thriving civilizations, now reduced to barren rocks floating in the void. And she felt sick to her stomach. The Velkari lost 4 homeworlds to the swarm, Veltorak continued, nodding toward a delegation of insectoid beings who sat in grim silence. The Thesians lost 7, and the great Marathi Empire, which once spanned 100 systems, was reduced to a handful of refugee ships. He paused and let those words sink in before he spoke again. There is only one response that has ever proven effective against a Class 7 swarm, and that is evacuation. Elena felt her heart pounding as she realized what was about to happen. And she rose from her seat, even as the High Arbiter raised his hand to call for a vote. The Council will now vote on invoking Protocol Exodus for the Sol system, Veltorak announced. All in favor of authorizing emergency evacuation rights for the human species, please indicate now. Lights began appearing across the chamber as species after species voted in favor, and Elena counted them with growing despair as the number climbed higher and higher. 341 votes in favor, and only 6 against. The motion passes, Veltorak declared. And there was something like sympathy in his alien eyes as he looked at Elena. Humanity is hereby granted emergency evacuation rights under Protocol Exodus, and 12 transport vessels will be dispatched to Earth within 60 cycles to begin the relocation of the surviving population. Elena finally found her voice, and it rang out across the chamber with a strength that surprised even her surviving population. She demanded, stepping forward until she stood at the edge of her delegation's platform. What exactly does that mean, High Arbiter? Valtorek hesitated for just a moment before answering. Our vessels have limited capacity. Ambassador Vasquez and the journey to safe space will take many cycles, he explained, his tone gentle in the way one might speak to a child who did not understand the harsh realities of the universe. We estimate that we can relocate approximately 2.3 million humans before the swarm arrives. The number hit Elena like a physical blow, and she gripped the railing in front of her to keep herself from falling. 2.3 million out of 11 billion. That was not evacuation. That was abandonment. And she said as much in a voice that shook with barely controlled fury. You are asking us to choose which fraction of 1% of our species gets to live, she said, while the rest are left behind to die. We are offering you the chance to preserve your species, Valtorek replied. And there was genuine confusion in his voice, as if he could not understand why she was not grateful. Many civilizations would have given anything for such an opportunity when the swarm came for them. Elena looked around the chamber at the hundreds of alien faces watching her, some with pity and some with indifference and some with what might have been curiosity. And she realized that none of them expected humanity to do anything but accept this fate. They had all run from the swarm at some point in their history, and they could not imagine any other response. There must be alternatives, Elena said, forcing herself to speak calmly, even as her mind raced through possibilities. Weapons we could use, defenses we could build. Something other than running. The Carthax ambassador, a massive reptilian being covered in scarred scales, let out a sound that the translator rendered as bitter laughter. We tried to fight, he said, and his voice carried the weight of ancient grief. 3 times we tried, and 3 times we lost entire battle fleets without slowing the swarm by a single cycle. Fighting a devour swarm is like fighting a star-going supernova, added the Theshan delegate, her pale blue skin seeming to grow even paler as she spoke. You cannot defeat a force of nature, Ambassador. You can only get out of its way. Elena stood there for a long moment, surrounded by beings who had accepted defeat as the only option. And she thought about Earth and everyone she had left behind. She thought about her parents in their small house in Argentina, and her brother who worked as a teacher in Buenos Aires, and the billions of humans who were going about their daily lives without any idea that their world had just been given a death sentence. And she thought about what she was going to tell them when she returned. I will bring your offer to my government, she finally said. And her voice was cold and hard in a way that made several nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. But I want you all to understand something. She looked around the chamber one final time, meeting as many eyes as she could. Humanity did not crawl out of the mud and survive ice ages and plagues and world wars just to run away from the first real threat we face among the stars, she declared. Whatever our leaders decide, I can promise you this much: we will not go quietly. With that, she turned and walked out of the chamber, leaving 347 species to wonder what exactly they had just witnessed. 48 hours later, Elena stood before the United Nations General Assembly and delivered her report. And the leaders of every nation on Earth listened in silence as she explained what was coming. When she finished, Secretary General Amara Okonkwo rose from her seat and looked out at the assembled representatives of humanity. We have been given a choice, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. We can accept the Council's offer and save a tiny fraction of our people, or we can stay and face this threat together. The debate that followed was shorter than anyone expected. For when faced with the prospect of abandoning their world and almost all of their people, the leaders of humanity found that they agreed on something for the first time in history. The vote was unanimous. Earth's official response was transmitted to the Galactic Council the next day, and it consisted of a single word that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. No. High Arbiter Veltorak had lived for over 800 years and had served the Galactic Council for nearly half that time. And in all those centuries, he had never received a response quite like the one that now glowed on the screen before him, a single word, transmitted from a small blue planet at the edge of explored space. And yet that word had thrown the entire council into confusion now. He read it again, certain that there must be some mistake or some translation error that had corrupted the message. But the word remained unchanged, no matter how many times he looked at it. The humans had refused. Evacuation Veltok immediately ordered his personal vessel prepared for departure, because clearly this young species did not understand what they were facing. And it was his duty as High Arbiter to make them see reason before it was too late. 3 days later, he arrived in orbit around Earth, accompanied by a delegation of senior council members who shared his concern, and what they saw below them only deepened their confusion. The planet was not in chaos as they had expected, with panicked populations fleeing toward spaceports or governments collapsing under the weight of despair instead. Earth seemed almost peaceful from above, its cities glowing with light and its transportation networks functioning normally, as if the approaching doom was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Velat and his delegation were escorted to a large building in a city called Geneva, where they were met by Secretary General Amara Okonkwo and a group of human leaders who did not look like people who had just received a death sentence. High Arbiter, Okonkwo said, greeting him with what humans called a handshake. We appreciate you coming all this way to speak with us in person. I had to come, Veltorak replied, and he studied her face for signs of the denial or madness that surely must be affecting her species. Because I do not think you truly understand the situation. Okonkwo smiled at him, and there was something in that smile that made him feel strangely uneasy. We understand perfectly, she said, leading him into a large conference room where screens covered every wall. The swarm will arrive in approximately 87 cycles, give or take, and when it does, it will attempt to consume our planet and everyone on it. Then why have you refused evacuation? Veltorak demanded, his confusion giving way to frustration. Why would you condemn your entire species to extinction when we are offering you a chance to survive? Because survival is not the same as living, Okonkwo replied, and she gestured toward one of the screens, which flickered to life with images of human history. We have been fighting for this planet since before we could write our own names. High Arbiter. The screen showed wars and conflicts stretching back thousands of years. Humans fighting each other over land and resources and ideas. And Veltorak watched with growing unease as he realized how much violence this species had inflicted upon itself. You are a warlike people, he observed, but the swarm is not an enemy that can be defeated with weapons. It is a force of nature that has destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than yours. Perhaps, Okonkwo acknowledged, but those civilizations did not have something that we have. And what is that? Stubbornness, she said, and there was no humor in her voice despite the simple word. We are perhaps the most stubborn species that has ever existed. High Arbiter, and we do not know how to give up. Over the following days, Veltorak and his delegation were given a tour of what humanity was doing in response to the threat, and what they witnessed shocked them to their core factories around the Vunj. World had already begun converting from civilian production to military manufacturing, with assembly lines that had once produced cars and appliances, now churning out weapons and defense systems at an astonishing rate. Governments that had spent decades hiding their military secrets from each other were now sharing everything openly, with classified technology flowing freely between former rivals. As if borders no longer existed, scientists from every nation had formed collaborative networks that worked around the clock, studying every piece of information about the swarm that the Council had ever shared with humanity. This is impossible, muttered the Carthex observer, watching as a joint team of American and Chinese and Russian engineers worked together to modify alien shield technology for human use. These nations were nearly at war with each other just 20 years ago. They still do not like each other, admitted the human guide who was escorting them, a military officer named Colonel James Chun, but they disliked the idea of extinction even more. The council delegation was taken to military bases where soldiers, trained with new weapons designed specifically to counter the swarm, and to research facilities where scientists worked on disruption devices that might interfere with the hive mind that controlled the creatures. They visited shipyards where humanity's small fleet of interstellar vessels was being converted into warships, and orbital platforms where defense satellites were being constructed at a pace that should have been impossible. Everywhere they went, they saw the same thing, a species that had decided to fight and was pouring every resource it had into preparing for war. "You are wasting your efforts," Veltorek told Okonkwo during one of their meetings. "Every weapon you build, every ship you modify, every soldier you train, all of it will be meaningless against the swarm." "Maybe," Okonkwo agreed, "but we would rather die trying than live." As refugees who abandoned their home, the council sent psychologists to study what they believed must be a mass denial event, a species-wide psychological breakdown that was preventing humanity from accepting the reality of their situation. What the psychologists found instead was something that disturbed them far more than denial. The humans knew exactly what was coming. They understood perfectly well that they might all die, and they had simply decided that they did not care. Interview after interview revealed the same attitude. From soldiers to scientists to ordinary civilians, and the words varied, but the meaning was always the same. "This is our planet." A factory worker in Germany told the researchers, "My family has lived here for generations, and I will not run. If we die, we die on our feet," said a teenager in Japan. "That is better than living on our knees. We fought over this dirt for 10,000 years," declared a soldier in America, his words capturing something fundamental about the human spirit. "You think we are going to just hand it over to some space locusts?" The psychologists reported their findings to the council with obvious confusion, because this was not denial or madness or any condition they could identify. It was simply humanity being human. Veltorek made one final attempt to convince the Secretary General to reconsider, meeting with her privately in her office as the sun set over Geneva. "I have studied your species extensively over the past few days," he said, "and I believe I am beginning to understand you." "And what have you learned?" Okonkwo asked. "You are not stupid, and you are not in denial," Veltorek replied. "You know that you cannot win this fight, and yet you choose to fight anyway." "Yes. Why?" Okonkwo was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the city below, where millions of humans were going about their lives with the knowledge that those lives might soon end. "Because some things matter more than survival," she finally said. "Because our children will know that when the darkness came, we did not run from it, and that knowledge will shape who they become." She turned to face him, and there was steel in her eyes. "And because, High Arbiter, we are not entirely certain that we cannot win." Veltorek left Earth the next day, and his report to the council was simple and direct. Humanity had chosen its path, and nothing would change their minds. The council officially designated Earth as a terminal civilization and began withdrawing all non-essential personnel from the Sol system and across the galaxy. 347 species watched and waited for the inevitable end of the stubborn young race that had refused to run, but 6 of those species, the ones who had voted against evacuation, were watching with something other than pity in their eyes. They were watching with something that looked almost like hope. The first ship arrived without warning, dropping out of hyperspace near Jupiter and immediately broadcasting a message that confused every human who heard it. "This is Admiral Lesia Kor of the Theshan Free Fleet." The message declared, We have come to fight beside you. Secretary General Conco was pulled from a strategy meeting to receive the communication, and she stared at the screen in disbelief as the elegant, blue-skinned alien explained why she had crossed half the galaxy to reach Earth. My people ran from the swarm 3 times, Desiakor said, her voice carrying centuries of shame and regret. We lost our homeworld, and then we lost the world we fled to. And then we lost the world after that. She paused, and something like tears glistened in her large violet eyes. My children do not know what our original sky looked like. She continued. They have never seen the forests where our species evolved or the mountains where we built our first cities. Because all of that is gone. And so you have come to help us protect our world? Okonkwo asked, still struggling to process what was happening. We have come to stop running, Desiakor replied. Your species has reminded us of something we had forgotten, that some things are worth dying for. The Dacian fleet was small by galactic standards. Just 15 ships that had seen better days. But they were the 1st of May, over the following weeks. More vessels arrived from the 6 species that had voted against humanity's evacuation, each bringing warriors and weapons and supplies to contribute to Earth's defense. The Carthex sent 3 heavy cruisers crewed by scarred veterans who had fought the swarm before and carried the memories of lost battles like wounds that would never heal. The Valkyrie contributed a science vessel packed with researchers who had spent their lives studying the swarm, hoping to find weaknesses that no one else had ever discovered. The Marathi, whose empire had once spanned 100 systems before the swarm reduced them to wandering refugees, sent their last warship and their best strategists, and smaller delegations came from the Trenkai and the Asari, species that most of the galaxy had never heard of, bringing whatever they could spare to the growing coalition. Galactic Council was furious. You are in direct violation of Protocol Exodus, High Arbiter Veltorak declared during an emergency session. The Sol system has been designated a terminal zone, and no council member is permitted to interfere. Admiral Desiakor, appearing via holographic transmission, simply smiled at him. Then remove us from the council, she said. We stopped caring about your protocols the moment you decided that running was the only acceptable response to any threat. The council debated sanctions and punishments, but in the end they could do nothing, because the ships were already in the Sol system and there was no force available to remove them. And secretly, many delegates watched the growing coalition with something other than disapproval, because humanity's stubborn defiance had awakened something in species across the galaxy, had awakened the memory of what it felt like to stand and fight on Earth. The preparations intensified as the coalition shared knowledge and resources that humanity had never had access to before. The Dacian engineers worked alongside human scientists to improve the disruption devices that targeted the swarm's high frequency, combining alien understanding of the creatures with human innovation to create something new. Your people think differently than we do, observed lead researcher Desiakor, watching a human team modify one of her designs in ways she had never considered. You take our technology and you break it apart and put it back together in configurations that should not work. But do they work? Asked Dr. Sarah Chun, the lead scientist on the human side of the project. Feshiaver ran the calculations again and then a 3rd time before answering. Yes, she admitted, and there was wonder in her voice. They work better than the original designs. The Carthex warriors established training camps where they taught human soldiers techniques for fighting enemies that could not be reasoned with or intimidated. Lessons learned through centuries of brutal warfare. You must forget everything you know about fighting intelligent enemies, growled Instructor Carthex Tor. His scarred face twisted into what might have been approval as he watched human Marines adapt to his training. The swarm does not think like you or me. It thinks like a hunger that has been given form. Then how do we fight it? asked Sergeant Maria Santos, one of the top Marines in the program. You fight it the same way you would fight a fire, Carthex Tor replied. You contain it, you starve it, and you never let it touch you if you can avoid it. The humans learned quickly, adapting the alien techniques to their own style of warfare. And the Carthex found themselves impressed despite their initial doubts about whether such a young species could handle what was coming. Meanwhile, the Valkyrie scientists made a discovery that changed everything. The swarm uses a specific frequency to coordinate its movements, explained research lead Valkyrie 2's, displaying his findings to a joint meeting of coalition commanders. We have known this for thousands of years, but we always believed the frequency was too complex to disrupt effectively. And now? Asked Admiral Desia Kor. Now we have human engineers working on the problem, Valkyrie 2's replied. And there was something like excitement in his usually calm voice. They have proposed a solution that we dismissed centuries ago as too primitive to work. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to match the swarm's complex frequency pattern, the humans suggested bombarding it with noise on multiple frequencies at once, creating interference that would scramble the hive mind's coordination. It is like trying to have a conversation in a room full of screaming children, Dr. Chen explained when asked to describe the concept. The swarm will still be able to function, but its coordination will be severely impaired. Tests proved the theory correct, and production of the new disruptors began immediately, but the most important preparation was happening in facilities that most of the galaxy had assumed no longer existed. Humanity had given up nuclear weapons decades ago, signing treaties and dismantling arsenals in the name of peace. But the knowledge of how to build them had never been lost, and now, with extinction approaching, that knowledge was being put to use once again. The swarm has never encountered nuclear weapons, explained General Alexander Volkov, the Russian officer in charge of the program. Every species they have attacked evolved past such primitive technology thousands of years ago. You think they will be effective? Asked Admiral Lesiakor, watching as the first of thousands of warheads rolled off the assembly line. I think they will be a surprise, Volkov replied with a grim smile. And sometimes surprise is the best weapon of all. The coalition also developed backup plans for if the battle went badly, including devices that could mask Earth's biosignature and make the planet appear dead to the swarm's senses. A last resort, Okonkwo called it. If we cannot drive them away, perhaps we can convince them that there is nothing here worth consuming. But everyone knew that the backup plans were just that, backups. Because humanity had not chosen to fight so that they could hide with 30 cycles remaining before the swarm's arrival. The coalition held a final planning session, gathering commanders from every species in a converted conference center in Geneva. We have done everything we can, Okonkwo said, looking around the room at faces both human and alien. Our ships are ready, our weapons are prepared, and our people know what is at stake. Then all that remains is to wait, Admiral Desiakor replied, and to hope that we have not come all this way to die for nothing. We have not, said a Carthex general, his voice rough with emotion. Whatever happens, we have already won something that was worth fighting for. And what is that? Asked Dr. Chen. The general looked around the room at the coalition that had formed against all odds, at species that had spent centuries running, finally choosing to stand together. We have remembered what it means to be brave, he said, and across Earth and throughout the solar system, 10 billion humans and their unlikely allies looked up at the stars and waited for the darkness to come. The swarm arrived 3 cycles early. Sensors across the solar system screamed warnings as the darkness emerged from hyperspace beyond the orbit of Neptune. And humanity got its first real look at the enemy that had consumed worlds beyond counting. It was worse than anyone had imagined. Swarms stretched across millions of kilometers, a living cloud of billions upon billions of creatures that moved as one. Their bodies ranging from things the size of insects to monsters larger than battleships. They had already begun feeding on the outer planets, stripping asteroids and moons of every useful molecule. And they were growing larger with each meal they consumed. All forces. This is Admiral Thesiakor, the Thesian commander, broadcast across every channel. The enemy has arrived ahead of schedule, but we are ready for them across the solar system. The coalition fleet powered up their engines and moved into position. A desperate armada of human and alien vessels that looked pitifully small compared to the approaching nightmares. The Earth defense grid activated, orbital platforms and satellite weapons coming online in a cascade of power that lit up the darkness of space and on the surface of the planet. 10 billion humans looked up at the sky and waited to learn if they would live or die. All ships, engage, Admiral Thesiakor ordered. And the battle for Earth began. The first wave of the swarm crashed into the coalition fleet like a tsunami hitting a seawall. And within minutes, dozens of ships had been overwhelmed by the sheer number of creatures. The Carthex cruiser Vengeance went down fighting, its weapons blazing until the very end as thousands of swarm organisms tore through its hull. The Thesian destroyer Hopes Light was swarmed by creatures that ate through its armor like acid through paper, and its crew died at their posts rather than abandon their stations. Human pilots and small fighter craft dove into the massive enemies, their weapons doing what damage they could before they were inevitably destroyed. And each one took dozens of swarm creatures with them into death. "We are losing too many ships," reported the human commander, Admiral James Morrison, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "If this continues, we will be destroyed within hours. Then we activate the disruptors," Thesiakor replied. Now, across the fleet, devices that human and alien scientists had worked together to create came to life, flooding space with a cacophony of frequencies designed to interfere with the swarm's hive mind. Coordination. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The perfectly synchronized movements of the swarm became chaotic and confused, with creatures colliding with each other and attacking in random directions instead of coordinated assaults. "It is working," Valkaratus reported from his position on the science vessel. "Their coordination has dropped by over 60%. All ships, press the attack," Admiral Thesiakor commanded. And the coalition fleet surged forward into the disrupted enemy for the next 3 days. The battle raged across the solar system as the coalition exploited every advantage. The disruptors gave them human and alien pilots flew mission after mission, burning through the swarm with weapons that had been designed specifically for this fight. The orbital platforms around Earth fired continuously, their crews working in shifts to keep the weapons operational as wave after wave of creatures approached the planet and on the surface. Ground-based batteries added their fire to the defense, filling the sky with destruction, but the swarm was adapting by the 4th day. The creatures had begun to develop resistance to the disruption frequencies, their movements becoming more coordinated again as the hive mind found ways to filter out the interference. "They are learning faster than we anticipated," Dr. Chan reported, her voice exhausted from days without sleep. "We are switching to rotating frequencies, but it is only buying us time." "How much time?" asked Secretary General Okonkwo, who had refused to leave the command center since the battle began. "Days. Maybe," Chen replied. "Perhaps hours." The coalition shifted tactics, relying less on disruption and more on direct firepower. And this was when humanity unveiled its most primitive and devastating weapon. The first nuclear warhead detonated inside a dense cluster of swarm organisms. And for a moment, a new sun blazed in the darkness of space. Millions of creatures were vaporized instantly, and millions more were damaged by the radiation and electromagnetic pulse that followed. They have never experienced anything like this, General Volkov reported. Watching the swarm recoil from the explosion, their biology has no defense against nuclear fire. More warheads followed, delivered by unmanned drones that flew suicide missions into the heart of the enemy. And each explosion carved holes in the swarm that took hours to fill, but even nuclear weapons could not stop an enemy that numbered in the billions. And the swarm continued its advance toward Earth, despite the losses it was suffering. By the 8th day, half the coalition fleet had been destroyed, and the orbital platforms were failing one by one as swarm creatures reached them and began tearing them apart. "We cannot hold much longer," Admiral Morrison reported, and his voice carried the weight of a commander who knew he was losing. "They are adapting to the nukes now, spreading out to minimize the damage from each explosion. Then we use antimatter," Okonkwo ordered. And even the alien commanders looked shocked at the decision. Antimatter weapons were considered too dangerous to use by most galactic civilizations, because the devastation they caused was nearly impossible to control, but humanity had built them anyway, because desperation has no room for caution. The first antimatter charge was delivered by a pilot named Lieutenant Sarah Williams, who flew her fighter directly into a swarm concentration so dense that escape was impossible. "Tell my family I love them," she said, her voice calm despite what she was about to do. And then she detonated her payload. The explosion was beyond anything the swarm had ever encountered. A reaction of matter and antimatter that released energy on a scale that even stars would envy. A hole appeared in the swarm that was visible from Earth. Millions of creatures erased from existence in a single instant. More antimatter charges followed, carried by pilots who knew they would not survive, but flew anyway, laughing in the face of death because that was the only response their species knew how to give. "They are magnificent," Admiral Lesiakor whispered, watching the human pilots sacrifice themselves with a courage that made her own species' bravery seem pale by comparison. "They know they are dying, and they fly toward death with joy in their hearts. That is humanity," replied General Kar Thexfos. And there was something like awe in his rough voice. "They are insane. And that insanity is their greatest weapon." The battle raged for 11 days, each day bringing new losses, but also new acts of heroism that would be remembered for generations. The Leshan flagship was destroyed on the 9th day, but Admiral Lesiakor transferred to a human vessel and continued commanding the defense. The last Carthex cruiser fell on the 10th day, but its crew had bought time for ground forces to reinforce a critical defense point on the moon, and humans died by the millions, soldiers and civilians alike. As the swarm finally reached Earth's atmosphere and began its assault on the planet itself, cities burned, and people who had never held weapons took up arms to defend their homes. And the sky was filled with fire and death and the screams of creatures that had never known defeat. But on the 12th day, something happened that no one had expected. The swarm stopped, not defeated, not destroyed, but paused, its billions of remaining organisms hanging in space and atmosphere like a held breath. "What are they doing?" Okonkwo demanded, staring at displays that showed the enemy frozen in place. Fulcaritus studied the data for a long moment before answering. And when he spoke, his voice was filled with wonder. "They are calculating," he said. "The hive mind is trying to determine if continuing the attack is worth the cost." "The cost?" Admiral Morrison asked, not daring to hope. "We have killed billions of them," Velcaritus replied. "More than any defender has ever killed before. And we have demonstrated weapons that they have no defense against." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost reverent. "For the first time in 50,000 years, the swarm is facing prey that costs more to consume than it provides in return." Everyone in the command center held their breath as the swarm remained motionless, the hive mind wrestling with a calculation it had never needed to make before, and then, slowly at first but with gathering speed, the swarm began to pull back. It withdrew from Earth's atmosphere, and then from orbit, and then from the inner solar system, retreating toward the outer planets where its remaining forces gathered. "They are leaving," Okonkwo whispered, and she had to grip the edge of the command console to keep herself from falling. "They are actually leaving across the solar system." Coalition forces watched in disbelief as the enemy that had never retreated began its withdrawal. And the cheering started. It was a sound that could be heard on every frequency. Human and An voices raised together in celebration of a victory that no one had believed possible. But Okonkwo did not cheer. She looked at the displays showing the devastation that covered half her world, the cities in ruins and the billions who had died, and she wept. They had won. But the cost had been beyond measure, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that the war was not truly over, only postponed, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, humanity had done the impossible today. They had taught the swarm to fear Asterisk. High Arbiter Veltarek stood at the viewport of Nexus Prime, his 4 eyes fixed on the distant speck of light that was humanity's sun, and he struggled to process what his instruments were telling him. The swarm had retreated in 50,000 years of recorded history. No species had ever driven back a Class 7 Devourer swarm. And yet the impossible had happened in a solar system that the Council had written off as a lost cause. "The reports are confirmed," said his aide, a young Velkari who seemed as shocked as everyone else. "The swarm has withdrawn beyond the outer reaches of the Sol system and shows no signs of returning." "How?" Valtarek whispered, the question directed more at the universe than at his aide. How did they do what we could not? He had no answer, but he knew that he would need to face the Council soon, and they would demand explanations that he did not have on Earth. There was no time for celebration. The planet was devastated in ways that would take generations to repair, with entire cities reduced to rubble and vast regions rendered uninhabitable by radiation and swarm contamination. 3 billion humans had died in the 12 days of battle, their lives sacrificed to protect a world that was now scarred beyond recognition. Secretary General Amara Okonkwo walked through the ruins of what had once been New York City, her footsteps crunching on debris that had once been the greatest metropolis on Earth. She was accompanied by Admiral Thesiakor and General Karthax Vos, the alien commanders who had stood with humanity through the darkest hours. And together they surveyed the cost of their victory. "Your people paid a terrible price," Thesiakor said quietly, her violet eyes taking in the destruction that stretched to every horizon. "Do you regret your choice to fight?" Okonkwo was silent for a long moment, thinking about all the lives that had been lost and all the futures that would never be. "Yes and no," she finally answered. "I regret every death, every destroyed home, every child who lost their parents, and every parent who lost their child." She paused and looked up at the sky, where cleanup crews were still removing the bodies of swarm creatures that had fallen during the battle. "But I do not regret fighting," she continued, "because if we had run, we would have lost everything that makes us who we are. And that would have been a death far worse than anything the swarm could inflict." 3 cycles after the battle ended, Okonkwo was scheduled to address the Galactic Council, and she spent the journey to Nexus Prime preparing what she would say. But when she arrived at the Great Chamber and stood before the representatives of 347 species, she found that her prepared remarks no longer felt right. She looked at the faces watching her, some hostile and some curious and some filled with emotions that her human mind could not quite interpret. And she decided to speak from her heart instead. "You offered us survival," she began, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. 12 ships to carry away a fraction of our people, while the rest were left to die. And you thought you were being generous." She paused and let those words sink in. You did not understand us. She continued. You saw a young species facing an impossible enemy, and you assumed we would react the way everyone else has reacted for 50,000 years, with acceptance and retreat. But humanity does not know how to accept defeat, she said. And there was steel in her voice now. We do not know how to run from a fight, and we do not know how to give up on our home. She gestured, and holographic images appeared in the chamber showing the devastation that covered Earth. The burned cities and the scarred landscapes and the mass graves where billions have been laid to rest. This is what victory looks like, Okonkwo declared. Not clean and not pretty, but real. Because we paid for every meter of ground with blood and fire and sacrifice. The chamber was utterly silent as she continued. Our cities are in ruins, but we will rebuild them, and they will be more beautiful than before. Our people are grieving, but they are alive, and they will raise children who will grow up knowing that their parents fought for them. Our planet is wounded, but it is still ours, every crater and every scar, and we will grow gardens in them. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who had watched her species nearly die and had done nothing to help. You called us a terminal civilization, she said. You withdrew your people and waited for us to be destroyed, and you were certain that you would never see us again. But here I stand, she declared, spreading her arms wide, ambassador of a species that refused to die, representative of a world that fought back against the darkness. And I am not here to ask for anything, she continued. I am here to tell you what we have learned, so that the next time the swarm approaches a populated world, you will know that there is another option besides running. She displayed data on the new weapons and tactics that humanity had developed. The disruption devices and the nuclear strikes and the antimatter charges that had finally driven the swarm to retreat. We are not special, Okonkwo said. We are simply stubborn, and stubbornness is something that any species can learn. When she finished speaking, the chamber remained silent for a long moment. And then something extraordinary happened. The Theshan ambassador rose from her seat and began to applaud. The human gesture that her people had adopted after seeing it performed by coalition forces. During the battle, other delegates joined her, and the applause spread across the chamber like a wave. Species after species rising to honor the humans who had done what no one else had ever accomplished. The Carthex did not applaud, because their species did not have that custom. But they stamped their feet against the floor in their traditional show of respect. A thunder that shook the chamber. Even the Volcari joined in, their voices rising in harmonic tones that their species used to express. Admiration High Arbiter Veltorek watched the display, and when the noise finally died down, he rose to speak. The Council formally recognizes Earth as a sovereign fortress world, he announced, his voice heavy with something that might have been admiration or might have been fear. And we will reconsider our protocols regarding Class 7 threats. He paused and looked directly at Okonkwo. You have reminded us of something we forgot long ago, he admitted. That sometimes the universe rewards those who refuse to surrender. Okonkwo nodded, acknowledging the compliment. But she was already thinking about the work that awaited her at home. There were cities to rebuild, and people to comfort, and a planet to heal. And she did not have time to bask in the approval of aliens who had been willing to let her species die. She returned to Earth the next day, and for the following years, she led the effort to restore what had been lost. It was slow and painful work, but humanity had never been afraid of hard tasks. And gradually, the scars began to heal. Cities rose from the rubble. New and different, but still unmistakably human. Forests were replanted in regions that had been burned, and life began to return to lands that had been touched by the swarm. Children grew up hearing stories of the battle, learning the names of heroes who had sacrificed everything so that future generations could exist. And across the galaxy, Something changed. Species that had run from threats for thousands of years began to reconsider their policies. Inspired by the example of a small blue world that had refused to accept defeat, the Leshens reclaimed the world they had abandoned centuries ago. Their warriors, trained by Carthax and human instructors who taught them how to fight, the Moratti began building warships again. Their engineers working alongside human designers to create vessels that could stand against any enemy. Even the Council began to shift its approach, establishing defense protocols that included fighting as an option rather than just evacuation, and in the dark spaces between stars. The swarm continued its endless journey, feeding on dead worlds and growing ever larger, but now it carried something new in its ancient hive memory. A piece of information that had been burned into its collective consciousness through billions of deaths. There was a small blue world circling a yellow star at the edge of the galaxy. A world inhabited by creatures that should have been easy prey. But those creatures had taught the swarm something it had never learned in 50,000 years of consumption. They had taught it that some prey bites back, and now, whenever the swarm's endless hunger turned toward the Sol system, the hive mind remembered the fire, and the death and the stubborn defiance of the beings who lived there, and it turned away to seek easier meals elsewhere, because even a force of nature can learn to fear, and what it feared was humanity.